may be democratically elected, but they are not Democrats. They think like Nazis. They speak like Nazis.
There is sufficient factual evidence that the AfD is pursuing anti-constitutional endeavors.
If these are the standards, then we'll find suspicious evidence in almost every party.
A shift to the right. The fact that violence is on the rise again. It's like politicians have become fair game.
And that's why this European election is also taking a stand against right-wingers.
Ahead of the European election, the AfD is making propaganda for Putin and spying for China.
We're the party that puts Germany first.
Well, that was a politician from Germany's far-right party, Alternative for Germany, known as the AfD, ending that very short video. Hello and welcome to News Desk, a weekly conversation that puts you at the very heart of the discussion. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Biresh Banerjee, and I'll be bringing the questions and the comments and the observations that you write into the chat that you should be seeing on your screens right now. I'll be bringing all of that into the discussion that we're going to be having and also putting them to our experts whom you'll be hearing from shortly.
Yeah, so this week we are talking about the far right in Germany and the impact it's having here and also on the political system. Now, it follows weeks of scandals and court cases involving politicians from the far right, most notably from the AfD. Now, that is a party that's very popular in Germany. So this week we are asking this question: is right-wing extremism endangering democracy in Germany?
And some of you have already shared your views on this question. I have two examples here for you. We had a comment from at RCCasual7525 saying there that extremists are products of wrong politics. Therefore, they are not a threat, but an indication. And we also have a comment from Evil Ice Cream 333, a very creative name there, saying, if crazy extreme right people exist, so do crazy extreme left. Both are bad. Normal people that are in the middle or don't affiliate with any side whatsoever are sick of all of it. So that was just a sample of the comments that we are getting in the chat section. If you haven't yet sent us your comment, now is the time to do it, so get typing. And while you do that, now is the time, I suppose, to introduce people to the guests who are sat at this table. So Alex, you all already know of. To Alex's right is Simon Young, DW political correspondent, who has reported on a number of the cases to do with the AfD, so you'll be hearing from him. To his right is Jared Reed, seasoned DW News Desk hand, and Jared will lay out the context within which we are having this discussion. Cherry Chan, again, you all have seen her on News Desk before, a seasoned hand as well. She will be looking at the chat today and communicating with a lot of you guys as you ask questions and bring in your comments and observations. One person that you will not see, but we will be hearing from him, and he will be giving us instructions in our earpieces through the duration of this conversation, is Wade Adams, who is producing this conversation today. And he is sitting in a room that you all can't see with our very able technical crew who are working as we speak to bring this conversation to you.
Yeah, great. And as well as Simon, who is our guest here to talk about the far right, particularly in Germany, we've got two other great guests coming up. The first is Johannes Kies. He is a researcher on far-right extremism at Leipzig University here in Germany. And then we'll be talking to Raphael Bosong, who is a security analyst at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Now, ahead of European elections, we'll be talking to him not just about Germany, but also about the situation across Europe. So do stay for him, because he will have a lot to say and be very interesting.
And you can send us, of course, very specific questions for these guests and their particular area of expertise. So while you consider the questions for our guests, it's just time to bring in Cherry, because Cherry, we have a poll question that the community can get involved with.
Yeah, right. So our poll question today is, what's driving the popularity of the far right? We have already got some votes, but for those of you who just joined, it's on top of the live chat. So do vote and share your opinions with us.
And there's 4 options for people to respond. So the 4 options being unease over societal change, identity and ideology, discontent with mainstream politics, and ignorance and disinformation. Do vote. We will have the results towards the end of this discussion.
Yeah, but first we need to do a little bit of a catch-up about what has been happening in Germany over the past week. And we can join now Jared, who's been looking into us. Just bring us up to speed with what's been going on.
Yeah, there's been a lot going on, Alex. I'm going to sort of work our way back a little bit, if you don't mind. So we can start on Monday of this week. That was when a court ruled that Germany's domestic intelligence services can continue to treat the AfD as a suspected extremist party. And basically what that means is that intelligence services can continue to have the right to keep the party under surveillance, to observe the party, to observe their members. And that's because of evidence of what they're describing as anti-constitutional activities. Now, this is a ruling that we have heard before because a little while back a lower court ruled the same thing. The AfD appealed, and this appeal was rejected this week. Now the AfD says they're going to appeal again to, I guess, a higher court because they say that these rulings are politically motivated. But what we do have is not one, but 2 courts in Germany who have categorised the AfD as potentially being extremist. And this was on Monday, so we can go to Tuesday and talk about one of the AfD's best-known figures. He's a man called Björn Höcke. He leads the AfD in the eastern state of Thuringia. He was fined for using a banned Nazi slogan in a speech in 2021. He's a former history teacher, Björn Höcke is, but he denied knowingly using the slogan and said basically that it was an everyday saying, according to his knowledge. Now, the presiding judge disagreed with that and said that the court was convinced otherwise. The reason we're really talking about him is because he is a very influential figure in the hard right of the AfD, and so much so that in 2019 a German court ruled that it wasn't libelous to call Björn Höcke a fascist.
And we can see pictures of him now, I think, so just to,
exactly.
If anybody doesn't know what he looks like.
This is what Björn Höcke looks like. So this is the leader of the AfD in the eastern state of Thuringia, who we were just talking about. We're going to skip back a few months now to January, when there were these really big shockwaves over a meeting that happened at the end of last year, where various figures from the Austrian and German far-right scenes met near Berlin to discuss the concept of remigration. And in the context of this meeting that's said to have happened, that basically is a euphemism for the mass expulsion of certain groups of immigrants, including naturalised German citizens. So we're really talking about millions of people. And on my screen here, we can bring up this report from Corrective. It's called The Secret Plan Against Germany. This is, so if you're interested in that, you can read more about it. Now, the people involved in this meeting do have differing accounts about what happened, but it was Corrective that did break the story using all sorts of methods, including hidden cameras, witness accounts, undercover journalists staking out this hotel. Now, this caused huge protests in Germany. We can see some of those protests that took place back in January. They went on for some weeks, and there was condemnation from the protesters, but obviously
Berlin, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. But across the political spectrum as well, people saying that these plans, this meeting essentially was reminiscent of some, really, really dark chapters in German history. In terms of how that's affected the AfD, there's obviously been a lot of scandals in the last few months. That has seen that their poll numbers take a little bit of a hit nationally, but in these 3 eastern German states where they're holding regional elections this year, the AfD is polling around 30%. I'm not going to talk too much about polling because I know you're going to do that a little bit later in this show. I just also need to sort of finish up with the fact that on top of all of this, we have been seeing some attacks, a lot of attacks on politicians of all parties, particularly the Greens, many people are blaming the AfD for sort of inflaming tensions in German politics that's led to a lot of these attacks happening as we speak. And Simon, I guess that's something you can talk about. There has been quite a lot of, I guess, an extraordinary number of attacks in recent months.
Well, certainly that's what's flared up in the media in the recent weeks. We are in campaigning season, of course, election campaigning for the upcoming European elections in a few weeks. And there have been these serious incidents, in particular a Social Democrat member of the European Parliament who's campaigning to retain his seat. He was badly beaten up by what appears to be a young member of the right-wing scene.
And that politician was Matthias Ecker, yeah.
That's right.
I think we've got pictures that we can just show as you continue to speak, so we can see.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he was out campaigning, doing what politicians do, not sort of provoking anybody. That's Björn Höcke we're seeing
Björn
again.
Höcke, yeah,
so
that's not.
He's not the one. But this man was essentially he was badly beaten, hospitalised, I think, for a short time, and the police have got a 17-year-old guy in custody. But it's not the only incident that we've seen. Other politicians have found themselves sort of, you know, unexpectedly approached by members of the public, and, you know, with things thrown at them, and in some cases injuries resulting. And I think what a lot of people are concerned about is that there is perhaps a breakdown of respect for politicians, for the normal workings of democracy among certain sections of society. And that coming in conjunction with what Jared was talking about, the various alarming stories of plans by far-right activists to, do all sorts of things. We've heard about the Reichsbürger movement as well, these Reich citizen people who essentially reject the German democratic setup as we have it here in this country, and so they want a different state entirely, sort of under a new Kaiser and that type of thing. These people too are sort of fomenting, along with the AfD, but they're not the only ones, fomenting an atmosphere of polarisation, and in some cases, at the margins at least, possibly encouraging violence. And violence is what we are seeing, political violence. In isolated cases, I wouldn't call it an epidemic, but it's certainly worrying.
And we must just add in, of course, that the AfD say that they have also been subjected to some violence, but most of the politicians appear to be from the Green Party, don't they?
Well, that's right. That's interesting. Yes, you're absolutely right. According to the numbers that I got here from 2023, which were German government official numbers, the AfD, the far-right party, said that they were the victims in 86 cases of violent crimes against them, more than any of the other parties. But I think that may well be because many people say the AfD always very deliberately, report everything that could be reported under that category. Some of the other parties say they don't follow it up in every case because it just creates complications. It may mean legal processes and other difficulties that they don't want to get into. So there may be some distortion in those numbers, but it's interesting because even when it comes to this question of street violence, the AfD have a tendency to sort of claim that they're the victims, that they're the ones being persecuted. Often they say by the state. In this case, it would be by whoever masked people, presumably coming up to sort of tear down their posters and interrupt their meetings. And
just briefly, just to talk about, I just mentioned their Green politicians, your colleague or our colleague from within the political team at DW, she herself witnessed an attack,
That's
didn't
right.
she?
I hope, I don't know if we've got that bit of video to hand, but my colleague, Emily Gordine...
I think we do have that video. Maybe we can just play that.
There it is. She was out in Cottbus, this is in eastern Germany, following a Green team around as they were putting up posters, and you can see there an angry guy dressed in black. We don't know who he is, but Emily told me that they've been shouting Heil Hitler in the background, and here you can see as they come up and approach our camera team, confronting them, insulting them, and eventually the Green campaigner there is spat in the face, and they were very threatening. They were pretty offensive, and you can see a little bit of sort of punching and shoving going on. So that just shows you, they don't mind that there's a camera team. Well, they said they didn't want it filmed. The police did turn up, and no doubt there will be some consequences. But I think this just shows the everyday atmosphere in some places. This was in a small town in eastern Germany, but
you'd think that a camera would put somebody off from wanting to attack a politician.
Yeah, I mean,
possibly.
you might think so, but you could equally think that perhaps some of these people, they like the notoriety that they might get through a media story like this, and they want to be seen, to be, positioned on one side or the other, because they, we could call this, to a degree, a part of this far-right phenomenon is a culture war, and people believe that they're fighting that, and some of them want to be seen. In other cases, I would say they're not always perhaps particularly political. They just like a bit of a punch-up, possibly. So we must distinguish. We've talked a lot about the AFD. It's not only the AFD there, if you like, the sort of parliamentary wing of the far right, but there are many other levels of it as well, and it's a problem across society.
Can I just bring in some of the comments that we are seeing in the chat? Something that Cherry is very ably moderating. We saw those images over there. This is basically candidates from the Green Party who are putting up campaign posters, and elections are around the corner in 3 Eastern German states, and the AFD is also standing for elections there. And there is some a reference to the campaigning there and the polling there that user Grant Johnston is making. He's saying there is no logical, rational or sane argument to continue allowing fascist extremists to run for office. Of course, he's not saying he's talking specifically about the AFD, but this is something that certainly maybe we might want to discuss. Another comment that Roger Wilco, 98, is making is talking about the far right. And he says, if the far right is growing, address their biggest points, take the power away from their arguments. I don't know how successful that as a strategy has been in the German political debate, but maybe you can speak to that.
Well, as for allowing fascists, I mean, to participate, that's interesting. The guy we were looking at earlier, the leader in Thuringia, Björn Höcke, this man who's been convicted yesterday of using a banned slogan, a banned Nazi slogan. He has been described previously. A previous court decision confirmed that it's okay, it's reasonable and not libelous to describe him as a fascist, so there is a case in point where there's almost. But having said that, of course, what do people mean? They mean that some of his views are unacceptable to them.
Yeah.
And they think that he's pushing in a certain way. But of course, the AFD, the Alternative for Germany Party, which is not seeking, it doesn't say in its political programme that it is seeking to overthrow the state, that it would like to have a more autocratic regime, that it, wants to, make sort of Germany a vassal state of Putin's Russia or anything along those lines. Indeed, they put forward a policy programme just as you might expect to find it from any other party, with economic policies,
we'll
with environmental policies.
In a few minutes.
And so, at that level, it would seem to be not the right answer in terms of the functioning of democracy to sort of exclude them in any way from the process.
Well, we will talk about that as well. Thank you very much, Simon. That's great. And I think it's a very good moment now to bring in Dr. Johannes Kies, who is a researcher on far-right extremism at Leipzig University. Great to see you, and thank you very much for joining us. We have lots to talk about. As you can already hear, there's lots of conversation and lots of questions all about this whole issue. I just think that before we start talking, we perhaps need to define what far-right extremism even means. And the Federal Office for the Protection of the German Constitution puts it this way, which I will read, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. It says the field of right-wing extremism is characterised to varying degrees by elements of nationalist, anti-Semitic, racist and xenophobic ideology. Right-wing extremists allege that a person's value is determined by the ethnic group or nation they belong to. And it goes on to say this notion is fundamentally incompatible with the basic law being the German Constitution. So, Johannes, I'd love to just first of all find out from you, where is the line between right-wing, far-right extremism? Because everything can sometimes be bundled into one pot, and that can offend many people and cause confusion.
Thanks for having me. So the definition of the internal secret service in Germany is basically what is also what we could call the consensus in the academic community, not even in Germany, but across the world. Researchers studying right-wing extremism use variations of this definition. Varying degrees is basically the question that we have to address. So to what extent is it acceptable, in quotation marks, acceptable to be racist, to be exclusive towards other people, and to be far right, we would say, well, if you tend to this sort of ideology, then this is to be considered far right. Is it by definition then already a case for the internal service, for the police, for law enforcement? No, not necessarily, of course. Is it necessarily already a reason to exclude somebody from the democratic political process, as we just entered this question? No, not necessarily. It is a question of degree. But when we look at the study of the far right across Europe, we see that there's these variations of illiberal, still democratic, but far-right politics, like Orban in Hungary, for example. And there's straight-out neo-Nazis, people that, also attack other people on the streets. They go to marches with torches, etc., these kind of things. That's also part of the far-right, certainly a much more violent, much more outspoken part of it. And they are connected. They're connected via their ideology, as this definition suggests, but they're also connected because people and actors, organizations tend to be much more fluid than they have been in previous decades. So what we have seen in recent years is that the far right in general, not only in Germany, but we can see it here as a case in point, has become much more hybrid, much more agile even. So they're actually quite modern in their appearance. They are much more changing and adopting to modern times.
So what would you say is fueling the far right in particular in Germany?
Well, there's a general sense of crisis that many people share, and there's, of course, reasons for that. We just came out of a pandemic and entered a war in Europe with the attack of Russia against Ukraine. Before that, we had a political crisis over migration. Before that, we had a euro crisis, a currency crisis. We had a worldwide financial crisis, a banking crisis. So we have been talking about crises all the time. I like to speak of it as a crisis cascade. And people get, after time, it's not the first crisis now that we are talking about, they tend to, it tends to do something with them. And that can be the bottom or the field for the far right to fuel mobilization. But then I think it's very important to see that this is not a natural process. So crises do not naturally lead to a rise in right-wing extremism. It's actors, it's political entrepreneurs that use crisis, that perform crisis, that speak about crisis, and transform these crises into narratives of catastrophe, and then say, well, look, people, we are the guys that can tell you, the true German people, a way out of this. And this is basically the historical, even fascist narrative that has been used in the 1920s, that is used by right-wing populists across the globe, and that has also been used by right-wing extremists in Germany, what we're talking about today.
Yeah, okay, and that's a good point, because we want to talk particularly about the AfD, this very popular right-wing, far-right party here in Germany. We know that at the moment it's polling from the latest poll of voting intentions here in Germany on around 18%, has been as high as 23%, and as Jared said, in some states up to around 30%. And we can see that there. This is the voting intention. SPD, Greens, FDP, all in the coalition government. And then there's the AfD on 18, which is higher than any of those parties within the government itself. I just want to play, you were talking about these crises and you know, what could perhaps be motivating, you know, how they're taking advantage of the situation. We've got some clips now from members of the AfD about some of those crises. I think we just need to listen to that and then talk about the people who are voting for them. So if we can just listen to that and perhaps understand why people are voting for the AfD.
The AfD comes along and says prosperity instead of climate, family instead of gender, the people instead of immigration, and peace instead of war. Instead of being a neutral mediator, the German government has taken a one-sided position for the West. It disregards Russia's security interests and acts as if the 2022 war just happened out of the blue.
We have to create Fortress Europe. We need Fortress Europe to protect our homelands. And we'll do that together with our European partners.
So those issues are important to many voters here in Germany. I would be very interested to hear from you of who is voting for the AfD, because it's clearly not all far-right extremists.
Well, people that vote or intend to vote for the AfD do hold predominantly right-wing views. So that has been shown for the last 6-7 years. In the beginning, in 2013, it was much more diffuse. The AfD started as a national conservative party. It was much more about a one topic, one issue party about the euro, about the eurozone. But from 2015 onwards, there are studies showing that people who vote for the AfD, they also tend to hold right-wing views, and they also place themselves more on the right wing spectrum than on the center or on the left. So there is a clear, I would say, a clear description of the AfD voter. The thing is, what kind of issues do these people find important? That's to some degree a part of what we are discussing all the time. I mean, we were talking about COVID or the war in Ukraine. We were talking about that as well, right? But it was reframed and framed by the AfD and other parties as an existential crisis for Germany. And with that, simplifying the increasingly complex world. And that's a second issue or a second feature of the characteristic AfD voter. He's far right. She.
You'll say okay,
mostly men. There's a gender. Yeah. There's a slight gender bias towards male. So he is predominantly male. He's thinking right wing. He puts himself on the right, and he also needs, and I mean this actually quite psychologically. He needs closure. He needs a simple solution because he's frustrated by these ambiguities about this complexity of modern society. So that is what, in my view, characterizes voters of the the far right and also the AfD.
Johannes, can I just quickly bring in...
Can I just say one quick thing? Just quickly on that, you say male, you say white. Are they also younger? Are they becoming increasingly younger?
No, not necessarily. There was a study that the Jugendstudie, youth study, that implicated that the young are now moving towards the right. The study is not very good methodologically. So in general, the age is not really the big issue when it comes to voting for the AfD.
Sorry.
There's a lot of commentary in the chat, Johannes, about the labeling, the so-called labeling of people as to who is far right and who is not. So we had Kind Death, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was asking what determines whether something is right or far right, what scientific device of measurement is being used. Just particularly to that comment, Kind Death, I think that was answered earlier in the conversation. For example, the definition from the Federal Office for the Protection of the German Constitution, that is an impartial definition there that does exist. But you do have a comment from Nitish Kumar, for example, who's saying the more you start calling normal people far right, the more people become far right. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, Johannes, about labeling people as far right and maybe that that generating a pushback from people and saying, yes, we are far right and being proud of it.
Well, that's what the AfD does. They tell people it's totally okay to be far right, to be on the right, to be against principles of the Constitution. What I'm doing is I merely describe. I'm just saying, I just describe what's happening. People answer in questionnaires. We ask them, what party would you vote if there's an election on the upcoming Sunday? They indicate, I would vote for the AfD, and they also indicate that they agree with statements like, we have too many foreigners in this country, foreigners are bad for this country, Jews are people that do not belong here, etc., etc. So the typical, and we addressed the definition of right-wing extremism earlier, as you pointed out. So I'm just applying what these people themselves tell us in service, but also on the streets, at public occasions. And so the funny thing about that is that somehow it's still not okay for them. They don't feel good about being called right-wing extremists. And that's maybe something good, because they still have the social norm that being right-wing extremist is not something good. And that gives me a little bit of hope, at least.
You can I just ask you, because you did bring it up, immigration. I mean, how much is immigration a contributing factor to people deciding to be far right or voting for far right parties? And I also ask this because Xander, for example, in the chat, is saying this wouldn't be happening if the left introduced common sense immigration laws. So I'm just wondering how much of a theme immigration is in determining who is a voter for the far right.
So migration has always been the bread and butter topic for the extreme right. Always has been the case, no matter what the immigration law says, no matter how many immigrants, how much immigration we actually have. So these are two different things. Immigration or migration as a topic for the far right. Remember, they want a homogeneous, ethnically clean country. So, of course, immigration is a major issue for them. The second thing is what is actually going on. And if we look at East-West differences, we have much lower immigration and migrants or people with migrant background in East Germany, yet AfD votes are much higher in the East. If immigration really was the problem, then the ratio should be the other way around, right? Also, it doesn't matter how many immigrants come to the country in a particular year or over a particular period of time. What matters is how it is addressed in the public discourse. And here, the far right is very eloquent and very successful in placing their issue in the public debate. And the problem is, and this was one of the first comments that you read out, shouldn't we just give in to the main claim or the main issue that the far right is driving on? That's exactly the problem. If you give in, you normalize this position and they go on, because their aim is not only to have a immigration-free country, they want to rebuild the whole system. They want to get rid of democracy in general. They want to get rid of everybody who's not German in their sense, and that includes all of us, and not because of our assumed immigration background, but because, for example, me, I'm an intellectual working at the university. I'm not German for them.
But that's not...
So this is something to consider, that it's not only about the...
I hope you're still there. We seem to have lost your picture, I think. But just quickly, you're saying... the AfD was originally, they did have moderates in the party, didn't they? And it's only more recently that it appears to have gone more far right. Isn't that the case? And I don't want us to be saying that everyone who is voting for the AfD believes that anyone who isn't German and all the rest of it should be living in Germany. I mean, surely that's not the case.
Perhaps
Simon,
I can just jump in there. If the connection is down...
You seem to have lost your picture, Johannes, so maybe it's... We'll just talk to Simon, then maybe we'll get your picture back, and we'd love to hear your views on this.
I was just going to say, because you made that point, which is I think a good point, that obviously not everybody who votes for the AfD either would acknowledge that they are part of the far right, or would sort of see that as the way to go. They wouldn't necessarily support all those policies. And if you're looking to find where is the distinction, well, we see that polls suggest about just under 20% of people say they would be voting for the AfD if there was a general election here anytime soon. And there are lots of studies, and I don't want to sort of bamboozle you with more statistics, but there's one study that's done repeatedly called the Mitte study, which looks at social values and particularly extremism, done by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is close to the Social Democratic Party, but nonetheless it's a fully scientific study. And they ask people about their views, things like what's their attitude on migration, do they believe in an autocratic type of government, do they believe in the democratic institutions, and so on. A group of 6 or 7 criteria, and according to that study, 8% of Germans, 8%, come out as right-wing extremists with a sort of fundamentally right-wing, far-right worldview. And that is, you might say, a pretty shocking number. So I think somewhere between that sort of 8% and that 20%, that is what we're dealing with. So when we're talking, if we ask the question, how much of a threat is this? How worried should we be, and people out there should be when they look at Germany now? I would say it's pretty concerning. These attitudes are embedded, and they're getting a voice because of the AfD.
Speaking of attitude, just a quick comment from the chat. Elifrium writing that the far right never understands that all cultures change. So maybe that is a message for the 8% of Germans that you were talking about there.
Johannes, you're back, I think. It would be good to get your a quick point on what we were just talking about and what Simon was saying, obviously about this 8% that have come out in research being the number of Germans who do not want anyone who is un-German here. And then obviously around about 20% of people who are actually voting for the party or say they will vote for the party in Germany. So, where do you think so that we're not labelling everybody as being far-right extremists, where do you think the line is?
Well, if you look at these numbers, and we do these kinds of studies ourselves, the numbers don't really change whether they're funded by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation or independently conducted or funded by research institutes. The thing is, we have a core of heavily right-wing extremist people. They have a closed, manifest right-wing extremist ideology. That's the 8%. But there's 30 to 40% who agree to statements like Germany should have less immigrants, etc. So the potential for the AfD to mobilize lies between these 8% of hardcore right-wing extremists. Some of them for some of them, the AfD is not radical enough, not extremist enough, so they don't vote in any way. But it lays between these 8% and the 30%, 40% that have anti-immigrant motivations or other kind of anti-democratic views. And it really depends on how the political actors, political parties like the AfD are able to mobilize that, because we had these numbers 20 years ago as well. In 2002 we started our own study, and every 2 years we do it again, and we see that actually the number of right-wing extremist people in Germany is decreasing over time. But what has changed in 2013 was a new party that was able to be socially accepted to some part at least. Not as the NPD, who was always framed or rightly understood as a neo-Nazi party, right. But the AfD was able to position itself as a conservative, still official democratic party, and it was able to mobilize on the sentiment that was already there, which is actually decreasing. It's really much more about mobilization than it is about how many people think exactly this thought in society.
Can I just ask you something about the point on anti-immigrant views, Johannes? You brought that up, and it is something that the chat seems to be reacting to, and I wonder if the other side to that coin, if it's a coin, is the so-called failure of integration, because this is something that Harshit Purohit brings in. He says a reactionary party like the AfD becomes popular when there is some form of failure of integration in the society. Is it the case? And if yes, then what is the way to solve it?
No, it's not about failure of immigration, because
integration, failure of integration.
Sorry. For the AfD, it will always be a failure of integration. Because if this topic goes away, their main issue goes away, and there's no reason to vote for it anymore. So they will go with this topic as long as possible. And the more we address it, the harder they will push it. So it's not really about how to address it. I mean, of course, there's a policy field, a whole field of for policymakers to deal with integration processes. By the way, not only for people who come here, but also for people who live here. I mean, the friction between East and West Germany, for example, are still ongoing. They're still existent, and this is also something we have to deal with. So. Integration, from a sociological perspective, integration is always a general thing that we have to achieve. And for the AfD, every failure in doing that, or every description that comes out as a failure, is a motivation or grounds for mobilization for it. So it's really not so much about integration itself, I would say.
I have a question then, sort of to round this off, really. Do you think the AfD should be banned?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it really depends on how the party develops. Right now, it is developing into a direction which gives ground to at least check whether it can still run in elections, whether it can still receive public money. I mean, in Germany, all political parties that run in elections get refunds from the state. They're state-funded, basically, and the AfD gets millions each year from the state. And the question is, does German democracy need or have to finance their opponents? The opponents of democracy? And that's certainly a question that I would say, no, why? Why should we? Why should our society, why should we as taxpayers fund our enemies? I don't think that...
you think that's a step too far, do you, in a democracy to ban it?
Yes, because the problem will not simply go away. We will still have these sentiments, we will still have these attitudes, we will still have political actors, political entrepreneurs, as I would like to call them, who will then reorganize and go again. So for me, really, the issue is much more, how do we integrate our society more successful? How do we, and I mean not integration of immigrants, I mean much more integration of all people in this country, in people that feel left out from the political system, people who feel that they have a decent wage but they cannot really make something out of it. These kind of integration, that's I think the thing that we have to talk about. And if we come to a general feeling and a civilized public discourse that deals with these issues, education, health, social policies, then, you know, the AfD will not play a role anymore. And we don't have to deal with them anymore. And we don't have to ban them, because banning is only the last resort that we should engage with.
Johannes Keys, thank you so much for your time. Very briefly, our question is right-wing extremism endangering democracy in Germany? Yes or no?
Yes.
OK, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Johannes.
Absolutely fascinating. And hopefully we will speak to you on another conversation here on Newsdesk. So thank you very much. Cherry, you've been in the chat. It's obviously been very active. I'd love to get an idea of what the mood is and what really is making people talk. What's getting them going?
Yeah, people there in the chat are very active, and many of them have actually opposite positions, and so it's a very lively, controversial debate going on there. As Birich was saying, that many people actually question the definition of far right. They are concerned about who we call far right. Why do we identify some people as far right? And many people also raise this question about far left, and they seem to think about far right in terms of what's relative and what's the opposite of far right, which is the far left. And people are a bit discontent with current politics as well.
So that it is a sort of a fed up with politicians and what's going on. Interesting. Thank you very much, Cherry, for that. And do let us know if if anything else springs up. Were you going to say something?
I just wanted to sort of highlight two things to sort of take with us into the next segment that Johannes, I think, really hit the nail on the head with. He talked about political entrepreneurs, almost suggesting that people take advantage of the situation, and the situation potentially is the cascade of crises, as he described it. So something that you were talking about as well, and without calling it that, essentially, it's a difficult time. We've come out of COVID, and it's been a difficult time for society in general. So I just wanted for us to maybe focus on those as we go ahead.
Yeah, you're looking at me as if I should say something. I mean, I think that's definitely true. There's a lot of drivers for discontent. The economy is one of them, the cost of living crisis, and this sense of, which Johannes also mentioned, sort of people feeling like they're out of touch. The politicians are way over there. They don't understand us down here. Something that in the past Germany's been somewhat protected against, because it has this wonderful federal system and very strong local government structures, so that people in their regions and in their localities can feel as if they've got somebody to talk to. But perhaps that is not working as well now as it did perhaps in the past. So there's a feeling that the mainstream parties are out of touch. There's been this splintering of the political landscape. We've got groups on the far left as well, possibly a new party sort of being born, a very slow birth process happening there. No suggestion that they are directly connected to anything to do with extremism or violence, but there are the big parties in the middle, let's say, are no longer as big and as sort of trusted as they once were. And so people are shopping around, and some of them are going to end up probably on the right of things. I do think that migration is, we perhaps haven't stressed it quite enough. It is the issue that if you want to look at all the far-right groups, that's the thing that brings them together. The AfD, as I said, parts of it anyway, want to be a political party with radical ideas, the economy, the environment, various things about foreign policy interest them as well. But if we include in the far right, these Reich citizens, people with their sort of fantasies of a new German Reich, but they're not just lunatics. They're on trial at the moment for planning armed insurrection and an overthrow of the state. So it's pretty serious stuff. But we've also got the sort of the skinhead boot boy type of guys as well who are out there, marching. Maybe they're sort of fans of the Third Reich in some ways. They just like to sort of provoke. But they too commit violence. They intimidate people. They are behind arson attacks against migrant hostels and those kinds of things. So immigration and the idea of a sort of ethnically homogenous Germany is, I would say, the broad issue that unites all these groups and allows us to say they are the far. And one other thing, perhaps I could just very briefly mention. I was this week on Monday in Münster, where the court was that Jared was talking about, confirmed a previous decision saying that the AfD can potentially be treated as an extremist group. That means to say that the intelligence services can continue to, surveil them, to infiltrate them, to listen to their phone calls and so on. And the judge there was very clear in saying, why am I allowing this to go on, this state surveillance to continue? He said it was because the AfD, there's ample evidence that they work against human dignity and the democratic principle. And he said that, he particularly mentioned remarks that they've made treating migrants, Muslims, foreigners, refugees, all these kind of groups as second-class citizens and not allowing them to be considered as German citizens or members of the community. Okay. And that was really, for me, sitting there in the courtroom, a very stark and clear statement, as clear as a judge can allow himself, of what this means, of what the far-right threat represented, in this case by the AfD, means. And that's where we are now in Germany.
Thank you very much, Simon. Amazing also that you were in that court at the time of that ruling. I do now just want to bring in our next guest, Raphael Bosong, who is a security expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you very much for waiting patiently for us. As you can tell, it's a very interesting and lots of things to bring into this conversation. Before we start really getting down to some of the nitty-gritty, and I want to expand it a bit more, so we're not just talking about Germany, but we're talking about Europe and the far right. I want to play 2 interview clips to you about this recent scandal engulfing the AfD that we've just been talking about, concerning dodgy links to both Russia and China, including allegations of spying. Now, we're going to hear, first of all, from Ursula von der Leyen, who is, of course, the President of the European Commission, and then we will hear from Alice Weidel, who is one of the leaders of the AfD. So I just want to listen to that and then get your views on it.
The AfD is making propaganda for Putin and spying for China ahead of the European elections. First, the AfD rants about the German people and the fatherland, and then the AfD betrays this fatherland to the autocrats. They should be ashamed of themselves. When I look back over the past weeks, and there's always a lot going on in Germany, all I read about is Russia and China, and how our party is being discredited and put through the ringer. This has been going on for months.
So, allegations of this spying and of these links to these hostile states being investigated. But just picking up on what von der Leyen was saying there, do you think that parties like the AfD across Europe, not just in Germany, but are being influenced by non-democratic autocratic states and hostile agents? Or do you think, from what Vidal was saying there, that some of these parties, such as the AfD, are being unfairly discredited and having the finger pointed at because they are doing so well?
Well, it's not so easy to put everything on the whole party, because the AfD, without any intention to defend them, is a very diverse group of people. And the problem is, yes, that there is a number of increasingly radical people who may well be under the influence of external powers. And in other European countries, there have been repeated allegations that party financing or other forms of support have been given by Russia in particular. And we've just seen the Chinese Prime Minister Xi Jinping in Hungary really celebrating sort of the supposed friendship or the Chinese influence in this country. So what I mean to say is it depends on the country, depends on the party. There isn't one clear picture to emerge. Not every party to the right or to the far right is substantially, influenced by foreign powers. If you look at Scandinavian far right parties, there isn't yet at least such an influence as far as we can know. But overall, I think there is a risk for two reasons. The number one is that, like the AfD, you have this kind of rather new and up-and-coming party which attracts a lot of rather dubious characters. And I think this is mainly the case with the AfD now, that rise to the top through some rather extremist rhetoric, and people don't really know where they're coming from, and then they're maybe vulnerable for monetary reasons or for other reasons. And this is one serious thing. And the other thing is that, well, particularly once these parties, for example, in Italy, also in France, were more in the wilderness and were struggling more, they may have received support already then, many years ago. And there is, again, at least only allegations, but I think credible allegations that these kind of long-term ties are something that hold them back. And so I can't give you one answer to this, but I think overall we need to be definitely a lot more vigilant, and also our counter-espionage really has to step up the game. And we need to be really also very sort of sensitive to maybe not sort of illegal activities, but this kind of long-term game that especially the Chinese are playing. So this is what I just alluded to in Hungary. It's of course perfectly legal to have a state visit, but we know this comes with a much bigger package of influence. And this is something that I think a lot of sort of right-wing parties are likely to follow, saying, well, we don't like Brussels, we don't like, liberalism. There are other powerful countries that offer more conservative values, even China, or be it Russia, and why not? Why not deal with them? And so even if it's not undue influence, it's like an open gate, it's an open door.
Just to bring in a comment, Rafael, from the chat, people picking up on the point of the neoliberal establishment, so to speak. Jim Nicola saying that the single most driver behind the rise of the far right is due to the policy failures of the centrist neoliberal establishment across the globe. Bad austerity-based economics is central to that. I don't know how much you agree to that point of view.
There is a point here. I mean, again, not trying to make a smokescreen. It's a lot more complex and depends on every country as well. Say some countries in Central Europe, they really had a more rocky period of liberalization and also wide inequalities in the 90s. Or you also had it in Greece, but then you had left populism there rather than right-wing populism. So it's not one fits-size-all answer. But yes, overall, it contributes to the sense that a certain segment of the population, for economic reasons or also for cultural reasons, doesn't believe in this kind of story of progress and modernization and globalization and all of that. And the kind of far right, but also sometimes the far left, offer an alternative to that, something more sort of saying, well, you're in a ethnic homogeneous group, you're rooted at home, we defend your traditions and we defend your economic interests. So depending how you understand neoliberalism, I think that's definitely part of the story. But if I may also say one thing, like take the example of Hungary. I mean, it may have been well the case that Orban was voted into power because there were these economic, inequalities and turmoil. But once in power, he also took every measure possible to consolidate the regime. And now it really isn't a country anymore where you have fair elections. So it's one question to say, well, a party gets to 20-25%, and it's another then to say, once they take over, they really rebuild the system and maybe pretend that they speak for the people while they actually don't.
So given that there are now these far-right parties in power across Europe, Hungary, also Italy, and others as well, do you think that they are a threat to democracy in Europe?
They can be, yes. I mean, Hungary is a definite clear case where this happened. In Poland, we just recently had this partial reversal. I mean, not in every respect, but there was a competitive election and the kind of populist right party was voted out, and now there is a transformation again happening. So you could say that's the normal to and fro of democracy. Depends on where you look. I think in overall, as I said, like if you have a threshold crossed, then really there is a serious threat to democracy. It happened in Hungary. It can happen elsewhere. Thankfully, we haven't got a clear-cut case of the same kind just yet. But it's something on the horizon. And I think what worries me most is France and Italy. I mean, in Italy now, people are used to say, well, Meloni, okay, it's a post-fascist party and, they have some specific policies, but she's kind of run-of-the-mill. We can work with her. And it's still too early to tell. There may still be constitutional changes coming next year. There is some talk of increasing censorship. And, if she stays in power for another 5 years, I'm not so sure whether this is the same assessment then. And similar in France, well, at the moment, okay, Le Pen is not in power, but everybody is worried about the 27 elections, the presidential elections. And the French president has enormous power. So if there is someone who comes in there who really holds radically different views, he or she would have a lot of leeway, as we saw in the US as well. So in those cases, I'm actually rather worried, yes.
How unified, we've also got elections coming up within Europe, these European elections in a few weeks' time. How unified, coordinated is the far right within Europe?
Not particularly well. I mean, they have had for years these attempts to form a unified movement. Really, most of them came to nothing for a number of reasons, because on the one hand, of course, in the end, they all stand for national interests, and national interests, if everybody is really egoistic, doesn't necessarily come together all that well, but also for other kind of substantive policy differences and also internal competitions. I just mentioned the case of Italy. Before Meloni and the Fratelli d'Italia, there was the Lega Nord and Salvini, and now they're in government together, but they're also really actual serious rivals, if not enemies. And so now, in recent years, we also have this divide over Russia. So, Hungary being rather or even very pro-Russian versus Poland, even under the previous one being very anti-Russian. So the right is not one monolithic bloc. However, I think the major thing that's on the table now is that even if you don't get everybody of the far right into one faction or one group, the center right feels under such pressure by these kind of growing numbers of far right parties that the center is increasingly tempted to move to the far right, open coalitions or other forms of cooperation. And so that you rather have a sort of coming together of the center right and a substantial part of the far right, rather than all the far right coming together. And I think this kind of shift of the center is really the more, it's a part of democracy, but potentially also very risky development.
Did you have any questions in the
Not
chat?
at the moment, no.
OK, well, I wanted to ask you, in terms of then these sort of far right, the far right generally, is the EU, do you think, tackling this whole rise, or is it sort of shunning away and putting its hands up and pretending it's not really happening?
Well, I mean, it depends on where you stand politically, obviously. I mean, various parties in the election campaign now for the European Parliament have made strong statements. I mean, the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Liberals, trying to, warn the electorate, say, this is a very important election and you have to make a stand, and there is these radicals at the gates. So, yes, there is this awareness. And also, say, institutionally or officially, there is, of course, concern with true extremists, like people who are ready to resort to violence, both on the left or on the right. So there is some coordination on that. But it really, again, all depends on the country. I mean, we have 27 states and they have rather very different understandings. What is far right, what is extremism, what is acceptable, what is not, what is legal, what is not. We come together now on some new, particularly online laws, the new Digital Services Act, where, they also can have takedown orders of certain extremist stuff across the borders. And the EU is claiming that they do more about disinformation, foreign interference, like from Russia in this kind of media space. But this is only nascent and it's just started to begin. And ultimately depends also on national implementation and national authorities. And I just said there is a lot of diversity here. Yeah. So, something is going on and people aren't clueless, but we are not singing from the same page, like the same, the same outlook on what exactly this kind of threat is and how serious do we have to take it.
So the question is right-wing extremism endangering democracy. We said across Germany, but not just Germany, Europe. Do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of countries where it is problematic, and it's not to just kind of say the liberals and the previous governments in power has always got it right. I mean, one more time, there is also a legitimate room for even more serious and bigger reform. And yet, I mentioned repeatedly Hungary. This is the clearest case. Then there is, at the moment, the case of Slovakia, although, I'm not sure whether you mentioned previously a program. I'm not sure what the effect of it will be, but then rather recently re-elected after a period in opposition, populist right-wing Prime Minister Fico has been shot today. I don't know how serious his condition is and what that means, but Fico was already in the process of, and I really don't mean to by any means condone this kind of act of violence if I criticize Fico now. I don't want to create any form of misunderstanding there. I'm just saying the situation in Slovakia now is completely unclear what will happen next. Yeah. But he was previously seen as an ally of Orban and somebody who sort of took control of the public media very forcefully, changed anti-corruption laws, and seemed like trying to follow the same rule book. And then there are other countries, for example, also classic Western Europe. Western European is a matter of definition, but I told about Italy. We'll see whether next year there will be constitutional changes. They're already doing a lot on migration, which is perhaps across the line of what we would accept. And then there is Greece, where there is also very serious allegations of the use of spyware, of repression of media. All these things are quite documented. And I'm not saying that all these cases are at risk of completely losing democracy in the next 1 or 2 years, but it can be a gradual chipping away at the foundations. And maybe eventually we end up in a place where in 3, 4, 5 countries, elections won't be fair and free anymore. Yeah. There will be elections, but under what conditions?
OK, thank you so much, Raphael Bosong, also for the that information about Slovakia, which possibly Jared is looking into as we speak. But we will let you go. Thank you very much for your insights, and we appreciate very much for your time today. So thank you. Jared, have you found any information about that?
Basically, our own website, DDW, is saying that Robert Fico was injured following a government meeting. He was in a shooting. 4 shots were fired. 1 hit him in the stomach. And as I understand, it appears that 1 person has been detained in that. That's about as much as we know. It occurred sort of in a small town northeast of the capital, Bratislava, today.
Okay, thank you
And we
very
don't know
much.
anything about the motivations, or if there's any connection to any far-right motivations. This is just what we know.
That's
just
right,
to be clear.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jared. Simon, moving on from obviously not talking about Slovakia, but talking generally about this whole issue of the far right and endangering democracy. What has sort of stood out for you so far in the conversations that we have had with our other experts?
Yeah, well, I think that was very interesting what was being said there, that there's quite a diverse picture that Rafa was painting of the different stages of the debate, of debates about migration, about the far right in different countries. I suppose that reflects the diversity of Europe. The picture is not clear. It's slightly difficult for us to kind of say, is the far right sort of on the advance everywhere? Clearly, different European countries have different sort of political cycles and so on. What I was going to add was that what we have in relation also to the European political institutions, and that, after all, it's the European Parliament that's about to be elected in a few weeks, is at least allegations, pretty clear allegations, though, of infiltration there by both Russia and China. Yeah. Some people are saying it's absolutely clear that both those countries are seeking to use any point of entry they can find to influence the debate there. And the most striking case that we've had is a guy who was working in the office of Maximilian Grou. We saw a clip of him a little bit earlier on. He is the lead candidate for the AFD in that election, and his assistant in his Brussels office has been accused of essentially giving secret information from European Parliament meetings to the Chinese intelligence, but that's just one example. Yeah. There have been lots of examples, suggestions, allegations. There's nothing being clearly proved, or nothing sort of that's ultimately damning. But there are lots of suggestions of influence, of money changing hands, brown envelopes, that kind of thing. The list of senior AFD politicians who've over the years been to Moscow and said all sorts of wonderful things about how Vladimir Putin should be listened to, even in the context of the current war in Ukraine, saying that that maybe it's time to make peace and we've got to take into account Russia's concerns. Well, maybe there's some argument there, but the terms in which they've done it, the timing of their meetings has been very ill chosen. We've seen, in the European Parliament, we've seen Maximilian Grou and others standing up to cast doubt on stories about the oppression by the Chinese regime of the Uyghurs, for instance, or talking about, saying that the democratic movement in Hong Kong was somehow, being engineered by the West. These kind of things keep coming back. Yeah. I think it's no coincidence. There's a big story in the Czech Republic where the Czech intelligence have uncovered a load of documents and chats, some of which also points to the AFD and other far-right groups with links to Russia and China. And the list goes on. I mean, we don't have time to review it all, but I think it's important to say that it's highly plausible that parties like the AFD, and in other countries they've got other names, but they are all being used to kind of sow talking points that those autocratic regimes would like to hear, and more widely, and that comes to our point, undermine the functioning of democracy here in Europe.
Thank you very much, Simon. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Should we have a look at where the poll is at?
We should.
Yeah, because we'd asked you guys the question at the outset, at the start of this discussion. And that question was, what's driving the popularity of the far right? And this is where we turn to Cherry Chan, who potentially has the results of this question.
Yeah, so we have 308 votes. Thank you all. The results are quite similar between our four options. So the one that most people vote for is discontent with mainstream politics. That's basically what we also discuss here in the discussion. 31% vote for that. And then 26% vote for unease over societal change. 25% vote for ignorance and disinformation. And 16% vote for identity and ideology.
Thank you very much. That's a good spread, isn't it, on what the options were. Thank you, Cherry. Thanks to everyone around the table. Thanks very much also for being with us in this conversation. It's been a really good chat. I hope you agree.
I do agree, and we will potentially have another interesting subject next week on Wednesday, but then you can tune into the community tab on YouTube on DW News and find out what that subject is going to be. We ourselves don't know what that subject is going to be, but then tune in 24 hours in advance on Tuesday for the conversation on Wednesday. And we hope to see you then and hear from you then.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.